My topic today is domestic violence and food insecurity in California. The reason that I chose California is because of the data sets that I was working with. I will, at the end, talk about Los Angeles, but a lot of the issues in terms of presenting that data were sample size. So let's get started. So just to talk about my data sources, so I used the California Health Interview Survey, CHIS, which is actually run on this campus at UCLA, down over by the School of Public Health, and the California Women's Health Survey. For anybody who's looking for any type of statistics, I would greatly suggest that you go to these sources. They're very user-friendly, especially CHIS. They have an Ask CHIS tool that's really easy. You don't need to know statistics to use it. So if anybody's interested, I highly recommend that. So first what I will do is talk about domestic violence, which has been termed intimate partner violence in data sets. Then I'll talk about food insecurity, which is now the research term for hunger. And then I'll talk about intimate partner violence and food insecurity together. So intimate partner violence, the way that it's defined is physical abuse, sexual abuse, threats, and emotional abuse. And the thing about emotional abuse is that it wasn't measured in the California Health Interview Survey or the California Women's Health Survey, and that's a major limitation. The reason that they usually don't include it is because of validity. And I don't think emotional abuse has been defined to the point where they could ask it in a question and then get valid answers that are the same across all the people surveyed. So that's a major limitation in these numbers, and you could argue that the numbers are then an underestimate because we don't include emotional abuse. So this is a graph of men and women who have experienced intimate partner violence in the last 12 months. And it's important to note that these are men and women who are below 200% of the federal poverty level. And so just for reference, for a family of 4, that's about $40,000 of income a year. And in the past year, you can see that 5.8% of all females in California have experienced domestic violence in the past 12 months versus 3.3% of males. And then in terms of health status, so this is a question where they ask you, how would you rate your health? And you can say excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. And as you would expect, people who have experienced violence by their partners, and this is just women now, were less likely to report that they had excellent, very good, or good health compared to those who had never experienced violence. And so this measure is different from the previous one. This one is if you've ever experienced violence since you're 18 years old. And I'll continue to use that aspect throughout the presentation. So, and if you have any interpretation questions, just feel free to interrupt me. So that was intimate partner violence, just so you can get an idea of that. And then there's also food insecurity. And so it's important to know the labels. And so it used to be called just hunger, but it was recommended to USDA, which does a national survey on food security, that they changed the label to food security. And so as you can see, initially they still had food insecurity without hunger or food insecurity with hunger, but they removed hunger because they said that in a way it's a psychological sensation and therefore it can be experienced differently. And so for the purposes of research, it would make more sense to then call it low food security, very low food security, marginal food security, and high food security. And so low food security and very low food security, that's a typo, not insecurity, would count as food insecurity. And so I'll just be using food security and food insecurity in the rest of the presentation. So the percentage of women who are food insecure in low-income households by race and ethnicity, and the source for this is the California Women's Health Survey, and it was their last survey, so about 2004, 2005. And in this report, interestingly, Latino women were said to have the highest numbers of food insecurity. followed by African American women, white women, and then Asian women. And then also health status by IPV experience amongst women who are food insecure. And so the same thing with IPV, people who had experienced violence by their partners and who were food insecure were more likely to report fair or poor health. Okay. So intimate partner violence and food insecurity together. So when I was looking at studies, one of the things that I noticed was when studies talked about IPV and when studies talked about food insecurity, they were mentioning the same groups that were at risk for these. So that was people who were low income, people of color, women, and single women with children. And so part of what I wanted to explore was, are these the same risk groups for people who have experienced both intimate partner violence and food insecurity? And so that's what the rest of the graphs are going to be looking at. And so this is just a comparison between men and women. And so this is the percent of men and women who have experienced IPV and who are also food insecure. And so women, 54% of women who experience IPV are food insecure versus 47% of men. And so this might not look like a huge difference, but it's important to note that women are twice as likely to experience IPV. So in effect, the actual numbers are actually a lot more than men. Does that make sense? So that, and then also this is for women. And so amongst the women who have experienced violence by their partners, as you would expect, more are food insecure than women who never experienced violence by their partners. And the argument is if there was no relationship between intimate partner violence and food insecurity, you would expect these to be the same. You wouldn't expect to see greater amounts of women who experience violence to be also food insecure than those who haven't. Okay, and so then again, health status. And so this is amongst women who are food insecure and once again, who are at or below 200% of the poverty level. And so if they didn't experience violence, even if they were food insecure, 60% still reported that they had excellent, very good, or good health. But if they did experience violence, only 53% reported that. Okay. And then, so going by ethnicity, so like Annalena had said, African American women in South LA were more likely to be food insecure. And in terms of experiencing violence in the past 12 months, 74.4% of women, African American women, who experienced violence in the past year were also food insecure. And so that's pretty staggering. And 61.5% of African American women who experienced violence were also food insecure versus 31.6% of African American women who never experienced violence. And the reason I didn't include other racial groups is because they weren't necessarily statistically significant. And so these were the ones that were. And so it's not to say that this only affects African American women. It could very well just be they didn't interview enough people. Okay. And so this is a graph to show food insecurity amongst women who are women with children and women without children. And so women with children were found to be at highest risk for IPV and food insecurity in separate studies. And so as you can see in this graph, women with no children, only 49% of women with no children were food insecure versus women with children. And these are populations that have both experienced IPV, so it's adding another layer onto it. And once again, we would expect these to be the same. Okay. And so then going to, okay, let me go back. This is single and married women put together. And then this next slide is single women only. So these are single women with children. And so 67% of single women with children who had experienced IPV, I'm sorry that's not in here, but that's what this is, were food insecure. And then once again, you can see this really high number, 74% of single African American women with children were food insecure who had experienced IPV. And then 67% of single Latino women with children who experienced IPV were also food insecure. And so, okay. So before I go into the other things, I think this is a good place to put in some experienced IPV and weren't able to afford enough food. In Los Angeles County, just doing women versus men, 30% of women who had experienced violence weren't able to afford enough food or were food insecure versus 9% of men. And so that's a huge difference right there. And then also in terms of women versus men, it was very similar. It was very similar to California data in terms of women were more likely, wait, I just said that. So women were more likely to be, yeah, never mind. But anyway, so the point that I wanted to make is in LA, I tried to go further down and do it by spa levels, which are the service planning areas, but the data there wasn't enough sample size for that. But it's important to know that Annalena had talked about high levels of single motherhood in South LA. And so taking this data and applying it to that, one could imagine that those are might be high levels of food insecurity and domestic violence. And so I looked on the Centers for Disease Control in terms of what they said about IPV and food insecurity. And one of the things they said about IPV was that it's not enough to know that IPV and food insecurity affect certain people in a certain area. We also need to know why. And so this study it's sort of preliminary. The next step would be to do more statistical analysis. And part of what I would like to get out of this presentation, and I hope you all got valuable information as well, is to sort of get your feedback on, so now what? What are the next steps to exploring this relationship and illuminating it in terms of the causes? In statistics, you can't really say that domestic violence causes food insecurity or vice versa in terms of what I did. You have to do a lot more. But I'm interested to know what people think about further exploring this relationship in LA and also statewide. So please feel free to ask me questions later on. I'll use my sources.